which I thought was just a good thing to kind of center ourselves in what is we'll be drawing out in different ways, is that colonial Latin American life virtually always had an African flavor. And we saw this early on with the Iberian Peninsula, that already before the establishment of the Americas, the Iberian Peninsula had been, the Spanish and the Portuguese had been developing, it had been interacting with West Africa, had already in some parts basically considered to be an important part of life to have an enslaved person in your house or in your monastery or in your city. And so this is already going on before we get to the Americas, but it's perhaps accentuated in the Americas. I feel like this is something that I feel bad that I don't know more about. In the same way that many of us in the United States do not know the roots of our own traditions and how crucial the African and African American contribution has been, this is also true in Latin America in different ways and for different reasons. So all of a sudden last night I was thinking of just, playing you the top 10 samba songs of all time and going through, looking at some Brazilian carnival stuff just to give us that flavor, give us a little bit of the flavor. But I would encourage you to reach out and examine some of this stuff. A lot of people in Latin American societies today also do not know about this as much. For example, the African presence in Mexico was pretty strong, especially in places like Mexico City. But because of kind of the intermarriages, some of you talked about this, the intermarriages and mixed offspring, as an identity, there's very little that could be said to be Afro-Mexican in today's world. So it was pretty strong in the colonial period, but in contemporary Mexico, you wouldn't find that as much. In contrast, in places like Brazil, of course, and the coast of Colombia, the coast of Ecuador, it's a huge presence, and throughout the Caribbean as well. I first want to talk a little bit about the terminology that they use here. Now, this book was written in 2018, and in their later work, both Matthew Restall and Chris Lane have gotten better about using this terminology. But in the olden days, people in this chapter, and we'll try to correct a little bit in this chapter, people would just refer to other people as slaves, the slaves. And I guess there's a little bit of, I don't want to just be doing this for what we call political correctness, but I think it's important to understand that, like, when you call another person by a term like a slave, that implies that it's kind of their identity, that you can't change that. And so people have tried to talk more about either enslaved Africans, if we're talking about Africans, or enslaved indigenous people, if we're talking, or just an enslaved person, to emphasize the state of enslavement is a state, and people were not in it, and then they got put into it. Some people, especially in the United States, became born into it, but other people got out of it. So it's a state in which people pass through, and they are persons all that time. And so the whole notion of enslavement, or the whole notion of slavery, is to try and take away your personhood, to take away someone's personhood and make that person into a thing that can be sold and bought and made to do things. And if we keep using the term slave, then that basically does the work of turning a person into a thing. So you see the difference there between it. So we're going to try to talk about this as enslavement and enslaved persons, emphasizing these are people who have been enslaved. Everything is just a capitalization thing. And in Restall's afterword, which I showed you that little page from, when he goes back to these terms. So on page 173 of this book, they say they were people who fought as Black conquistadors. And in today's world, we would capitalize that Black conquistadors. And you can kind of see why you would do that. For example, if you look on the same page, it talks about from bridging Spanish and Native communities, and Native is is uncapitalized. And of course, if you had the name of this particular indigenous community, you would capitalize it. But it seems a little bit unfair to just say the Spanish get to be capitalized and they don't. So when we do this, we're going to try and capitalize the native part, or especially, I think the term indigenous has become more widely used. So again, this is simply to kind of update a little bit from 2018 or 19 when this book was published, how people have started to rethink some of the ways in which we describe people in history and who gets capitalized and for what reasons and what kinds of, what we should call people, how we should consider history. And it has, I think that for those of you who read parts of When the Word is Past, that Clint Smith book, he talks about going to these museums and, the guides would say, look, if you can't see what people were like in the past, then it makes it difficult to see actual people in the present too. All right, let's start out with a map that we saw back a long time ago in the Iberian chapter, I believe, or was it Atlantic Africa, sorry. And where it talks about slavery was in many ways the heart of Iberia's colonial enterprise in the Americas. And I brought out this map, which shows you in broad terms, the places of origin from Africa and where people were taken. And in this chapter, we get some numbers on that. So 4.7 million into the Caribbean and 4.2 million into Brazil. Again, roughly speaking. And so I think I estimate about 80 or 90% of the enslaved Africans were either were taken to either Brazil or into the Caribbean. And that seems to be a little bit borne out here by the numbers. We talked about how, and they talked about here, really the British North America was a pretty smaller player in this at 500,000. And on page 176, they say it was, so most of the people, as we say, were taken into the Caribbean and mostly to work on sugar plantations, mostly for sugar. In North America, to work on tobacco, rice, and later cotton plantations in the 18th and 19th century. I think this next sentence on page 176 is also important. I talked about this a little bit in Clint Smith's book. British North America was unique in that the enslaved population grew naturally. By naturally, they meant that they were deliberately bred and sold as children with substantial encouragement from slave owners. There you go. Whereas the tropical colonies relied on constant imports, mostly of young men. And so it's not that there weren't large numbers, and still are today, descendants of Africans, but a lot more were just basically taken in as workers, as cogs on the plantation machine into the sugar plantations. As long as we're reading here, I think that this next part about Brazil will help, as we're about to talk about the wonderful Portuguese. Thus, the majority of Africans brought to the Americas had the misfortune of being mass slaves, mostly plantation workers, and the largest portion was absorbed into the Brazilian plantation system. It's just an enormous number, and the misfortune of having to get into Brazil. Now, I have to say the Portuguese in this chapter don't come off the best. Yeah, they kind of get reamed on, and maybe they deserve it, because they did dominate the trade in enslaved Africans from 1492 to 1640, probably from before that too, because they were sailing down there. So, I think this is probably worth getting down on the Portuguese just a little bit, because most people have no idea, right, about how many and how large, and probably including people in Portugal today.
Most of the book that we
Anyway, before we get too down on the Portuguese, we should just note that the English dominated the trade from 1640 to the 19th century, and it became even larger. Now, they're probably taking enslaved people mostly to their own places, Jamaica, but they were the ones that were dominating this. And then they decided that they should make it illegal, and so then they got all on their high horse and started trying to make it illegal for anybody to do this. And so, I don't know. Yeah, the English have a peculiar relationship to morality too. Seem to have had many moral compunctions about it, at least that we know of. This chapter leads off with a Spanish friar getting rather upset about it, but we don't know if the Portuguese feel the same way. Oh, that kind of came up in the movie, the Mission that we're watching, right? That guy from the Portuguese part of town seemed much happier. Well, both those guys, the Spanish and the Portuguese, are fine with it, but Portugal had the legal authority to do it. I guess I will mention at the time that some historians have said that if you think back to the Iberian Peninsula and their relationship to Islam and the Muslim caliphates, they felt that they were behind the Muslims and they wanted to catch up. They wanted that was seen as the place of progress. Yes, they were the infidels, but they were also more sophisticated. They had a larger empire. And so in some ways, some historians have said that when the Portuguese and the Spanish started using their own enslaved Africans, that what they were doing was in some ways copying and imitating what the Islamic societies have been doing, and thinking that that was a way to sort of get ahead in the world, be progressive or have progress in the world.
Seems pretty strange to me, considering a lot of West Africans were Islamic. I mean, Mansa Musa was from West Africa, and he was, Muslim. So
yeah, and here's this rich person who probably himself was an owner of enslaved people, and so they would think, oh, okay, that's what we should do to be a powerful person in the world. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too justificatory here. So we've just read about how Brazil is sort of the single largest destination, which is, of course, the colony owned by the Portuguese. They had great ways of keeping the enslaved people from rebelling on the ships and on the plantations, right, Liam? There's all sorts of strategies it's kind of like an initiation period. You're here, and so you get to take it out on the people below you. And, a lot of the overseers themselves, like give them the positions in which they get to take it out on somebody else. Also divisions, like putting together people who spoke different languages so they wouldn't be able to talk to each other. Common tactic in the United States as well, by the way. Very, probably around the world, right? If you don't want people fighting against you, make sure they can't talk to each other in the same language. So, I mean, I think Josie pointed this out, that it seems like also at least according to Resson Lane, the sugar plantation system in Brazil was harsher, and it was a very gendered, like I said, bringing in these young men basically to staff the sugarcane plantations, break their backs, and I think especially on the Brazilian plantations, I think that the average lifespan after arrival was something like 7 years. Now, again, there were lots of people who lived longer, escaped to various places, or were able to have different situations, but it was pretty bad. So on page 172, a lot of you commented on this page, and I think it is important. Reston Lane tell us about the difference between what they call mass slaves and mass slaves and auxiliary slaves, which will change the name of to mass enslavement and auxiliary enslavement. So on societies, and the mass enslavement happens mostly, as we've just talked about, on plantations, also on ranches and in mines, some mines, not all, but a lot of them. And so that would be a place in which you have lots of people brought in order to basically extract something or grow something and process things. Whereas for people in these auxiliary roles, we're more like in, I might consider the service sector, or maybe some urban areas where you'd have people around, but it wasn't in mass. And the enslaved Africans were often sort of the intermediaries between the Spanish and even might be the overseers in indigenous communities. 173 that auxiliary Africans adapted readily to indigenous cultures. They had to learn indigenous languages, share foodways, and live in the countryside, which made them more knowledgeable in many cases than their European masters of indigenous ways and concerns. So I'll talk about how this created some blended societies, but this usually happened when it was more, again, an auxiliary enslavement. And so we have societies that are based on enslavement or slavery, what they call slave societies, which is actually not the rule in Latin America. So certainly Brazil is what we might consider a slave society. It became for several centuries, just the demographics of it meant that it was a very divided society. And some parts of Spanish Latin America, some of the French colonies, for example, but a lot of the Spanish area colonies were more societies with slaves, societies with slavery. So it was a part of life. It was an important part of people's lives, but it wasn't the dominant thing going on. So again, this is again, most of Spanish-controlled Latin America, the African presence was always there and always prominent in various ways, but would get, as Pluto just said, enmeshed in sort of godparenting, compadrazgo relationships. So there'd be a kind of wide range of society, and it wouldn't necessarily be a society that was completely divided into sort of masters and enslaved, such as what happened in much of Brazil. Now I want to talk here for a second about these sugar plantations, and I want to draw on the work of Sidney Mintz. I think I mentioned him to you at the last class. Last time I taught this class, I had people read this book, Three Ancient Colonies, which is somewhat discussed on pages 179 and 180, The Sweet and the Bitter. Mintz's most famous book is called Sweetness and Power, and I think they're kind of drawing from that, but I just wanted to draw a couple lessons out from there. What Mintz is saying is that in this part of the world, we have what he calls the first commercially marketed soft drugs. Not the hard drugs. By soft drugs, he means tobacco, coffee, chocolate, and sugar. And chocolate, of course, comes from the Americas in what is now Mexico, where chocolate comes from. They did not have it with sugar, but they do. The Europeans combined it together. Coffee is, of course, from the Middle East, and again, was not taken with sugar, same with tea. But the brilliance of the Americans was to take this sugar thing and put it in everything. And so, coffee and sugar, tea and sugar, for those of you who know what the British are like. And so I think my one kind of complaint about these two chapters is that that in Lane's later work, he talks about how the silver from Potosi changes the world. It supplies half the world's silver. It creates some of the first modern cities and economies. And the same thing happens with these soft drugs, that it's hard to imagine modern life without tobacco, coffee, sugar. Impossible to imagine that probably without sugar. So Mintz calls this the slavery sugar plantation complex. And it was, again, responsible for most of the enslavement was headed for sugar plantations. It was often deadly. Just to get there was often deadly, and it was a massive operation. As Restall and Lane put it, and Mintz really emphasized this, some people believe that the sugar plantations, they say here, some historians consider it a foreshadowing of modern industry. The things that you needed to do on these plantations to take sugarcane from sugarcane and make it into the good sugar, it all had to be done on site. And so unlike other stuff that was kind of shipped around as raw commodities, this was a process that was very intense, from the cutting through the striking to the processing of it. It all had to be done on site and on a time schedule. And so although these were often enslaved persons, they were working in ways that look very industrial before there was an industrial revolution. Mintz and others have claimed that, in fact, these were the first modern identities. And what he means by that is that prior to this time, people would identify maybe with their families or with their ethnic group or with their geography of origin. Whereas these people have been torn from all of that. They didn't have anything to reference except their identity as a worker or an overseer, as a part of this new capitalistic system. Now, this would also radically change both European food habits and food habits all over the world. Before the soft drugs, before sugar got used as a sweetener for beverages, Europeans in general drank a little bit of beer or a little bit of wine all day long. Was what you did, especially if you were an agricultural laborer. My own great-grandfather, Italian, would go buy and the cheapest jug of red wine that he could find. And then he'd have a little bit in his coffee in the morning. You have a little bit at lunch. You have a little bit at dinner. And that was just what you did. Or beer, wine in your coffee. I know, not the best, but that's what they did. Maybe not the Europeans, but anyway, it was common to do that. Now, basically, this was not good for industrial life. Imagine, instead of having a coffee break, you have a wine break, beer break. It was probably more nutritious, but it wasn't good for industrial life. And so what happens is you take away that beer and that wine that you were drinking all day and the agricultural labor, and you put people in factories and you give them smokes and sugar, and that becomes like the major source of calories. So sugar goes from being this exotic spice that you use a little bit or only the king would have, to being the food of the people. And so this does fuel, quite literally power, the Industrial Revolution, which we learn a lot about, but we don't always learn about the places these commodities came from. Anyway, again, this is my one little complaint with historians when they only concentrate on one part of the world and are going to tell us about daily life, is the big picture stuff. How did this change all of our lives? All right. So, there was a lot, as we talked about with indigenous communities, there was a lot of damage done, a lot of problems, but also we can point to various resilience and differences. We talked about the role of Black of Africans on every conquest expedition, and even in some cases as themselves, Black conquistadors. Actually, a fascinating little box in there about the Black sailors, who you might not have known about all these sailors, dock workers, and that as on page 184, as many as 1/5 of the men aboard European whalers and merchant vessels in the Atlantic world were Black slaves or free men of African descent, some even as captains. So this was a huge part of the sailing world back in the day. And we also have these blendings of societies where the African overseers would know more about the indigenous societies, and even societies that became as African as they were indigenous. You got very mixed up and perhaps became more African. This actually happens in places in the United States too. You might see some of the tribal affiliations, especially in the Northeast. The people phenotypically look, how to say, as African as they do indigenous, and this was because people were thrown together or put together in these different ways. Pluto mentioned god parentage, or the ideas of compadrazgo in Latin America that would link people across, across sort of different sectors of society, urban to rural, sometimes wealthy to poor. There were also the fact that people would rent out themselves or their enslaved people, or they weren't allowed to work as enslaved on Sunday, and so that would be a time that you'd maybe make a little bit of money. And so people had prices, and some people were able to get wages to buy their own freedom and buy the freedom of their relatives. And I guess it's also important to note here that the people who became free often did then, if they were able to, they would themselves maybe own some land or own a plantation or enslave other people. And some of the, for example, some of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution were actually freed people of color who owned, by some approximations, 25% of the enslaved people on the island. So, I mean, this was a big trade. It was seen as part of everyday life, way to get ahead. And so it's important to note that this is not just something that the Spanish or the Portuguese did. This became something that was done throughout these societies. And imagine now, but there were like runaway societies that were like fighting them, or became, oh, that was another part of the Black sailors. Some of them became pirates. Like there are some pirates that people are like scared of. And the same thing here. It's like, they try to subdue them, or they try to go in and retake them. They'd be like, no. And then they'd have to make treaties with them, which is pretty intense. One of the most famous is it's a pretty big area on the coast of Ecuador. And it's actually gives us what is called the oldest known dated and signed portrait from South America. So these are like, basically there's several ideas about, some of them may have been, have escaped or fled from the plantation. Some of them seem to be and have gotten there from shipwrecks and were already then just basically free. They mixed and adapted with the indigenous, so they would combine African elements with indigenous elements. And here they are, like coming to the king, and basically they have these noble names and they're signing a treaty. Kind of crazy. This is the area of Ecuador called Esmeraldas, which, as you can see, goes up into coastal Colombia, which they talk about here as well, that gold mining area. So this whole western coast of northern Ecuador and Colombia is what they call it, a Neo-Africa on page 182. And then there's also a curious little pocket of Africans who I think were brought on a plantation, but it's up here in the Chota Valley in the highlands. And in this area, as some of my Ecuadorian professors would describe it, if you closed your eyes, you would think that you were listening to sort of native Andeans, but in fact, they're Africans who have settled in this area or were brought to this area and transformed it. This ever happened in the United States? We often don't know about how extensive this was in the United States. I got this from, but there were quite a few. This map says that at least 50 maroon communities active in the South between 1672 and 1864, and of course, lots of other stuff we don't read about, like the slave revolts and conspiracies. A lot of them were very violently put down, as they talk about in this chapter as well. But everywhere that enslavement happened, people either tried to fight or escape, and others also dealt with the system in the way how the word is passed book. Clint Smith complains that oftentimes he only got to read about Harriet Tubman and the people who escaped, and so he's like, well, why did anybody stay? Why didn't they just? It's like, well, no, it is very difficult. It's hugely difficult to escape. Yeah, so exactly. There's various ways of trying, but anyway, people did, and they stayed in these places, like the Great Dismal Swamp. That sounds like a good place to be. That's actually an interesting part of life. I want to turn us to Brazil because the Portuguese get such a bad rap in this chapter, but Brazil is also a place that is now one of the sort of richest and most vibrant traditions. And I too was interested in this because one of the wealthiest, she was once a slave, became one of the wealthiest women in Brazil. The diamond diggings were practically her personal fiefdom in the later 18th century. Imagine having a personal fiefdom of diamond diggings. That sounds awesome. So yeah, she became the subject of a Brazilian movie, and then Brazilians make some of the best soap operas there are. You don't even have to speak Portuguese to know what's going on. You can just, you just follow the romance. And I think I know more about the telenovela, the soap opera, than I do about the actual stuff, Josie. And you're correct too that Da Silva is kind of celebrated in Brazilian society as like, see, look, we're better than you. So there's this whole issue in Brazil, which has been prompted by many, let's say, US or North American researchers, and they'd go to Brazil, and because of the demographics and because it is such a vibrant society, they got kind of captivated by the idea that it was called a racial democracy, which also played into the hands of the Brazilian nationalists, like, yeah, we have a racial democracy here.
I mean, she could seduce people to get out of slavery. That's not a good thing.
Not a good thing, but she did it. And so she becomes wealthy. She gets to own all this stuff. Would never happen here, they say. So yes, that idea has been debunked, but it's kind of, how to say, it's possible to imagine why people thought that. For one thing, people now go and get all excited about candomblé and visit Brazil to see this sort of mix of healing practices and religious practices, which are part African, part Catholic, part indigenous. And of course, as I mentioned, the samba and the biggest party in the world, Carnival. We learn about Brazilian martial art of capoeira, which is both a national sport in Brazil now and also practiced in different parts of the world. So you can see why I think in certain ways this is seen as kind of this place in which people are have come together. Now, again, it is a very, very class stratified society, some of the biggest inequalities in the world, but it's also produced a lot of interesting stuff.